1000, 2 1000, 3 1000, 4 1000, 5 1000, 6 1000, 7 1000, 8 1000, 9 1000. Shoo. 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 Hi, everybody. Space habitation.
Tired of living on an overpopulated Earth? Why not move to the O'Neill Cylinder, an artificial state-of-the-art space habitat where we can control everything, including the weather. What would it take to build a space station like this? How big would it be? And how would we make it suitable for life? This is What If, and here's what would happen if we could build an O'Neill cylinder. When physicist Gerald K. O'Neill came up with the idea of his space colony in 1974, people thought he was crazy. Back then, a cylinder floating in space didn't seem like a space habitat anyone would want to move to. But fast forward to our time, the world has grown by 4 billion people. Climate change is on the rise. Moving to a space station doesn't seem so crazy anymore, huh? Now, this far-fetched idea inspires wealthy dreamers like Jeff Bezos, who is looking into building enough O'Neill cylinders to board 1 trillion people. But how exactly would this work? The idea behind the O'Neill Cylinder space station is simple. It would be a rotating space station about 6.5 kilometers in diameter and 26 kilometers in length. To build a structure that size, we wouldn't need to collapse all the planets in the solar system like we would for some of the other space megastructures. Mining our moon and some nearby asteroids should be enough to provide us with all the materials we'd need. We'd assemble the cylindrical station right in space, somewhere between the Earth and the Moon. We'd park the O'Neill cylinder at a Lagrange point where it would stay in place without being drawn into the orbit of either the Earth or the Moon. Constructing the O'Neill cylinder would be one thing, but we'd also need to make it habitable. That means giving it gravity, water, and a breathable atmosphere. Gravity would be easy. The cylinder would make a full rotation in 2 minutes. That would generate a centripetal force, which we would experience as gravity. To make the structure more stable and prevent it from drifting away, we'd need to build 2 counter-rotating cylinders connected at each end. We'd design the space habitat to mimic Earth's air pressure at sea level, and the built-in aluminum mirrors would give us control over the amount of sunlight getting inside the habitat. We'd be able to set our own day and night cycle and manage the temperature inside the O'Neill cylinder too. This space habitat would be powered by solar energy, gathered by all the solar panels covering the outer cylinder. We'd create artificial mountains, valleys, and forests. We'd bring in water derived from icy comets. To get around the cylinder, we'd use cable cars, or you could simply ride a bike. It would be like a mini Earth, but with us having complete control over its climate. All that would take 6 years and a few trillion dollars to build. And if you don't want to give up your home on Earth for some space habitat, the O'Neill cylinder would make a great vacation spot. Welcome to O'Neill Cylinder 1, where there's no gloomy weather and where all your food is grown at a local farm. Climb up our artificial mountain and enjoy a great view from our space habitat for the low price. Of course, there would be some challenges. We'd have to get really good at recycling all the waste aboard the space habitat, or it would quickly turn into a space garbage bin. Then there are the asteroids. We'd have to keep track of how much damage they cause when they hit the O'Neill cylinder so that the situation doesn't get out of hand. And you know, this isn't the only thing we should consider to make the O'Neill cylinder a safer place to live. If you want to know more, check out What If Discussed, where we talked to an assistant professor of biomedical engineering at UC Irvine, Ronke Olabizi, about the challenges of bringing people to a space station like this. Just tap on the link. Station like this. Just tap on the link.
This episode is sponsored by Brilliant. Could the most common future on the horizon be a future with no horizon? The O'Neill Cylinder is a massive rotating space habitat designed to house tens of thousands of people, or potentially even millions, and has been one of our most commonly discussed megastructures here on the channel. However, while we've discussed what an O'Neill cylinder is a lot, and even what the environment and ecology inside one might be like, we've rarely looked at what might motivate folks to move into one, or what their life would really be like once there. Partially because that is a bit tricky when asking what life inside one would be like, as the attraction of such habitats is that they can be made very Earth-like, and ideally life inside one is just like home. Yet there will be some differences, and potentially many. We should start by reviewing what an O'Neill cylinder is. The O'Neill cylinder is named for its original designer, Gerard O'Neill, and its basic form tends to be a smaller design with two such habitat drums, our nickname for a rotating habitat inside a large structure, often with windows involved to let the sunlight in. We often envision no windows on the design these days, with internal lighting provided by mirrors through smaller and safer window ports or simply electrical lighting. The original space art looks pretty cool and beautifully illustrates the core concept, but in practice is not a great design itself. Space is hostile and deadly. You want a lot of good thick steel between you and it, not giant windows in the floor. You then simulate the light or pump it in via mirrors to make it very Earth-like, assuming that's what you want. For our purpose today, we will mostly just be using the term to describe any such rotating habitat that's roughly cylindrical and has an axial length on an order of magnitude with its diameter or longer, and has an area of around 100 to 10,000 square kilometers. That is to say, big enough to support a reasonably stable community and ecology, but not one of the giants like the continent-sized Bishop Ring or McKendree cylinder, or the true leviathans like a Banks Orbital, Topopolis, or Niven Ringwald. Let me put an emphasis on reasonably stable community and ecology too. While even a fairly small rotating habitat could be made fully self-sufficient for geological timescales with certain technologies, we don't really envision them existing as a closed system by and large. Indeed, even the entirety of Earth is not, and even fairly isolated communities or ecosystems here on Earth usually are getting a lot of input and change from around them. They are not static. For a rotating habitat, that needs to be much more active and designed, but hopefully minimally so and mostly in the background. As said earlier, we are not too interested today in the maintenance angle, mechanical or biological or ecological or digital, as we examine those more in environments of space habitats already. Rather, we might start by asking why anyone would build such a thing, and not just one but many thousands of them. Building a few here and there for space exploration or novelty or prestige is one thing, and not a thing we care much about today. No, we are interested in what the setup would be when the average human could at least plausibly contemplate living in one. This brings up a lot of questions. First, is there an incentive to move there of an artificial kind? Folks often suggest we might build a lot of these in orbit around Earth and move into them, and turn Earth into more of a nature preserve, which might result in a tax incentive to move into these habitats, or even coercion. But as I've mentioned before, the more logical strategy for nature preserves is actually to put them in rotating habitats, as they're a lot easier to keep isolated from human interference or contagion from other ecosystems. And while humanity is responsible for a lot of extinction, we are not solely responsible. I don't know about other folks, but I want to preserve species against extinction from any vector, not just people. I don't really care what killed off the saber-toothed tiger, dodo, or mammoth, natural selection or human intervention. I just want to keep the critters we have around, or resurrect the ones who already died off. And an isolated ecosystem tailor-built for an ecology is easier to make that work for than Earth. I also have no idea how you get everyone to move off Earth without using coercion, which would be beyond repugnant to most of us, myself included. However, we do need to think of ways we could get a lot of people to move off Earth into one of these habitats, and the most obvious one is new living area. Planets are big places, but a sphere is not a particularly efficient use of raw materials, and terraforming can be a very long and expensive process. You might need to build 1 million such rotating habitats to equal the living area of Earth, but you can build 1 trillion of them using the same mass as Earth has, and thus get 1,000,000 times the living room. So overpopulation and general crowding might be one such motivation. Getting more elbow room is pretty much the driving force of migration in nature and human history, so makes a very good one. Another reason might be ideological, politically, religiously, or economically, similar to how many of the American colonies started. And so we'll spend some time talking about how these habitats might organize and govern themselves later on. But even that is fundamentally about getting more elbow room and space, and these habitats would seem ideal for that. Of course, for that to be true, it means you need to be able to make these things fairly cheaply and also make them safe and attractively. We often show O'Neill cylinders as looking like giant farms, forests, or parks, but there's no reason one couldn't be a crowded metropolis. The thing is, you don't really need more space for cities on Earth. You can have 1 trillion people on Earth rather easily, in terms of living area, even with parks. You need all that space for food production and general ecology. That need not be in an O'Neill cylinder though. If you want to preserve ecology, you do that mostly with dedicated nature preserves or quasi-dedicated ones, possibly a big cylinder with a rigid population cap. If I were doing one like that, I might say it permitted 1,000 people, half rangers and scientists, the other half wealthy folks who really wanted the big wide open nature space, but would agree to strict ecological measures, along with some carefully managed tourist industry. Doing that keeps the ecology pretty safe while providing funding. On the food side, we need a lot of space, but we can keep it cheap. You don't need to bother putting that on your habitation drum. Cheap, thin cylinders, potentially almost entirely automated and devoted to hydroponics, can get you way more bang for your buck, or grub anyway.
This section right here, I don't understand why these little things are spinning. You could just spin this entire cylinder.
Should note that if you haven't already grabbed a drink and a snack, it might be a good time as we'll be.
Looks like it's spinning. But then they have all these little mini cylinders spinning. Why do they have to spin? Why don't they just spin the whole entire cylinder at the right speed to foster the growth of healthy plants? And I mean, they could just make the construction of this area so much simpler.
Here for a bit. Such space farms can export food down to Earth if it comes to it, see the space farming episode, and can be used in tandem with in-habitat production to supplement it too. You could keep your livestock on pasture lands, but supplement them with hay or cereals grown and baled on some cheap space farm, assuming you don't.
I love this honeycomb mesh above, honestly, to make that in a 3D software like Blender or Maya, that's not an easy thing to make. I mean, I'm sure there's a trick to it. You didn't have to construct each little individual piece to it. Sure, you can just use some tools within the software to make it a lot easier, but still, that's a pretty advanced shape. Kudos to whoever built that.
Don't just produce your meat synthetically. So too, you might boost your own ecosystem's population density of critters by supplementing their food from robot-operated space farms. Either way, your default O'Neill cylinder wouldn't grow food any more than your default suburban housing development does, which is to say there's plenty of gardens and many do grow food people eat, but it's not capable of or intended for main food production.
Just looking at this scene right here, I just want to be clear that if you're building a space habitat, this is exactly what you don't want. You don't need all these buildings. You could just have all the living structure on decks below the main surface, and then in the main structure surface area you could just have green park space, really gorgeous park space. Just make it as beautiful as anybody can imagine, with every feature and luxury that you could possibly want built right into it. And then you would have either elevators or stairwells or both that go, and escalators that go down to lower decks, which are kind of larger, in a in a rotating habitat, like the lower decks would be a larger ring. So, that's where you could have all the living space. You don't need to have houses or any kind of structures really built on the main deck, because it's a completely controlled environment. You can have the perfect temperature, the perfect weather, the perfect lighting all the time. I mean, so there's no need for a structure for protection, you know? I mean, so let's keep going.
Transport isn't an issue either. Amusingly, it would be much easier to transport food from a space farm nearby than to truck it in from outlying farmland to a city on Earth. Getting into space is a pain. Once you're up there, though, moving back and forth between various habitats and stations that are orbiting the same planet is quite easy. Which also means that, much like nowadays, you can commute around rather easily from such habitats to some other nearby space station too. Though I'd not expect folks to commute to other stations daily much, except for those physically tethered together, which we'll discuss more later. So barring hub ports, nature preserves, public or private, and dedicated habitats like some amusement park or resort, we anticipate more of a suburban to dense rural or exurban layout for O'Neill cylinders. That might change with time so that one slowly grew into a metropolis, but my gut says main production will be to those looking for a few acres to call their own. Now, considering the cost of building and sustaining an O'Neill cylinder, obviously you're not doing this until your land costs on Earth are more or less the same as building and maintaining an equal amount of land in a space habitat. Such cylinders might be meshed together into collections of hundreds of them. We could see pricier land costs in one that was connected to a major habitat, for the same reason land can be rather pricey outside but near a city compared to, say, Montana. By and large though, especially in relatively early days, the paradigm of location, location, location presumably does not apply since space is huge and is located mostly next to nothing. People are moving there for space, and presumably are working from home, or our habitat needs to provide jobs. Of course, this assumes employment is anything like nowadays, and considering the cost of literally building land, that generally implies a huge amount of automation. Indeed, so much so that if someone says they're a factory worker, they probably mean they are the guy who oversees, maintains, or programs the factory robots, and possibly may not have ever set foot inside the actual factory, which might be thousands of kilometers from their home, and could be freezing cold or boiling hot, and utterly toxic or a vacuum inside. So let's say we are land developers getting ready to build such an O'Neill cylinder. A big first question has to be theme. What's attracting people to our place? Because while the mundane is nice, it never commands the best price. There's an assumption we'd mass produce these to standard sizes, and doubtless to some degree that would be true, but I doubt you'd see much cookie cutter arrangement given the scale. So each would likely include at least one weird thing, like a giant waterfall or low-gravity forest near the end caps, which can be cone or bowl-shaped. A question that arises, though, is if it's being commissioned or if you're building it with the intent of selling plots and parcels. My hunch would be that you'd have two major ways of doing this. First, an organization, such as a business or government, might entirely fund the thing or sell bits as they go, probably some being sold before the first hull plating was even being fabricated. Second, you might have groups of people get together to build one, each getting a chunk of land equal to their investment. Which raises a point on size. Bigger is better for the natural look, but we shouldn't just assume these things always get built as big as we can economically and safely produce. You can potentially add to such habitats over time if you want, making them longer, but in practice you just connect them together with others, so what you build is what you got. However, these things do require constant maintenance like any structure. See the Space Jandals and Maintaining Megastructures episode for details. So abandoning and scrapping one is entirely viable over just running it for tens of thousands of years, even when you feel it isn't big enough anymore. With some interesting implications. See the Space Derelicts and Trash Worlds episode for those. All of which means that while you probably build with both economic and generational growth at that, you probably will see many more conditions of smaller habitable cylinders than those pressing the boundary of what material strength permits. You might get one commissioned by just a few hundred people, intended for only a few thousand residents tops, far more often than the jumbotron's. As a hypothetical, your default village of maybe 1,000 folks, most living in or near town with the rest of known forest and garden and so forth, probably only needs to be 10 square kilometers to be considered rather ample and spacious. Just contrasting to several towns and villages of my chunk of semi-rural northeast Ohio. That would equate to a cylinder a kilometer in diameter and 3.2 kilometers long. About 2,500 acres of land and water on the section under state gravity for those more comfortable thinking of housing and acreage. Needless to say, that's a pretty arbitrary figure. You could go smaller or more dense or bigger or whichever. I think that number for population, more in terms of what works nowadays for an effective semi-isolated community. Dunbar's number, around 150 or 160 people, is a handy population size basis we've used before for discussing this topic for colony ships, but the minimum optimal size for a fairly self-contained community is very dependent on technology and culture. As an example, if you want to have your own school for a community, and with modern U.S. population growth rates, 1,000 people would have about 14 being born to them every year, but not really optimal for class size. Just one class per grade of 14 kids, give or take. On the other hand, if education shifted to smaller classes, or more remote, or one-on-one formats, that would not be a concern. It's hardly the only one way a larger community-sized helps, but it's a good example insofar as people tend to look at the schools heavily when picking a community to settle down and raise their kids in. And if anything, I tend to expect parents in a more prosperous society to be even more choosy in that regard. If you want to have a shopping mall inside your habitat, it needs to be either A, easily accessible to neighboring habitats, or B, have an total population large enough to support said shopping mall, which would obviously require many thousands of people. Then again, we probably will have a lot of giant shopping malls or plazas in the future as we transition to more online commerce. But don't think of transport and treat habitats as super encumbered. It's quite easy to build with only modern technology, the equivalent of a personal car as a spaceship or a space bus for public transport. The delta V such as it needs to drive a neighboring habitat in the same approximate orbit around the planet is small enough that you can commute over a larger distance than folks do now in less time and with less fuel. Plus, you really can lash hundreds if not thousands of these cylinder habitats together in a big static collage.
I don't know why he keeps showing this stupid animation. This is like the worst design. Maybe not the worst ever design, but like it's a really terrible, tragic design.
So two objects holding a planet next to each other will drift apart at one time. But even a thin rope would easily keep two houses together while separated by many meters of distance, so you just have to scale it up. Plus, with ships presumably constantly leaving and arriving, and likely being coordinated to avoid collisions and jams, you can strategically time a arrival and departure to provide thrust in the right direction or station keeping too. Most of these habitats rotate around on an order of a few minutes, part of why windows for sunlight are non-optimal. So coordinating arrivals and departures to get free station keeping is not introducing major delays.